Steve Hanke, professor of applied economics at Johns Hopkins University, returns to the show once more. And today we have a number of very hot topics, including geopolitical tensions in the Middle East. The nuclear deal with Iran is being negotiated this week, as a third of the U.S. Navy is reported to be deployed to that region as we speak. We'll talk about what's next after Iran just partially closed the Strait of Hormuz. Meanwhile, there's been a memo leaked from Moscow, apparently, that Russia wants to return to a dollar partnership. We'll find out what's actually happening there. And of course, we'll review the newest and latest economic statistics, inflation, and labor market numbers. Welcome back to the show, Professor Hanke. Good to see you again.
David, great to see you as usual.
Let's start this week's session by talking about Iran. They partially, by they I mean Iran, partially closed the Strait of Hormuz, a vital oil choke point, a large volume of global oil trade goes through the Strait of Hormuz every day, as you know. And it was well telegraphed that eventually they would make this move if challenged. Finally, they did that, and oil barely budged. So I'll just read you a few paragraphs from the CNBC article. Iran partially closed a strategically vital Strait of Hormuz on Tuesday, state media reported, citing security precautions. It comes as the U.S. and Iran hold talks in the Swiss city of Geneva. It marks the first time Iran has shut parts of the Strait of Hormuz, a major international waterway that links crude producers in the Middle East with key markets across the globe. So either the markets don't think that the Strait of Hormuz is relevant anymore to global oil supply, or they don't think it will be closed for long. What's your take?
Well, I think the Iranians were basically shooting a warning shot across the bow. They're indicating they can shut it if they want to. It wasn't as if they went out to shut it down. That's why the markets, of course, didn't do anything. But it's kind of a warning shot. They're basically telling especially the everybody, obviously their enemies in the West, that they can shut her down if they want to. And so it was kind of a little bit of a test run and a warning shot. That's my take on it.
Okay.
And by the way,
yes.
They said this is the first time they partially shut it down. In the past, they partially shut it down before.
When was this?
Oh, I mean, historically, they have done this before. Since 1979,
okay.
They've had partial shutdowns before. I can't remember, David, the precise years. I mean, don't get me in a corner and give me a quiz, for God's sake.
Well, you're the professor, not me. Once in a while, I have to quiz you. Lord knows I failed enough of your tests, Professor. But what happens? What would you expect to happen if we have a full closure of the Strait of Hormuz? Let's say things don't go as planned, the deal falls through, and they don't actually bluff anymore. Then what?
Oil go to $120 a barrel.
So it is vital still, the Strait of Hormuz.
Oh,
for
of
oil.
Course. There's no question about it. That means the Saudis would be shut out, the UAE would be shut out, and Kuwait would be shut out. And Qatar would be shut out. You'd have all the Gulf states shut off.
Okay, well, at that point, then, does the U.S. Navy take action and free up the strait?
Well, now we're getting into the scenario room,
okay.
And I suppose they would try to. Whether they would be able to do it or not, we don't know. We don't know exactly how they would shut it. I mean, if they sink a bunch of tankers in that little strait, it's going to take a while to clean it up.
Okay, this is the latest from the BBC. Iran says guiding principles agreed with U.S. and nuclear talks. Again, the talks in Geneva are still ongoing as of right now, so we'll see what happens by tomorrow or the day after if more concrete terms have been reached. But the meeting followed repeated U.S. military threats against Iran over its deadly crackdown on anti-government protests and its nuclear activities. Let's just help us understand both sides. What does the U.S. want, and what does Iran want out of this deal?
Well, it isn't what the U.S. wants. It's what Israel dictates what the U.S. says. So
okay.
the U.S. isn't an independent operator. They're just echoing what the Israelis tell them to do, what Prime Minister Netanyahu tells them to do. And there are a number of things that Netanyahu and Israel have said that they must have that the Iranians are just not going to go for. They essentially want the nuclear program to be completely dismantled and with no capacity to do anything peaceful or military or anything else. That's one thing. The other thing, they basically want the ballistic missile program in Iran to be defanged. So they basically want Iran to surrender, and Iran is not going to surrender. So the end of story. Plus, the real news in Iran, and I think one reason that the West, meaning who? The United States and Israel. Israel isn't going to do anything in there unless the U.S. is either flying cover or doing the heavy lifting. And the reason the U.S. is they have this big so-called armada there, but the reason they're not doing anything, I think, is that the Chinese have installed with the Iranians very sophisticated radar facilities that weren't there in the June War, by the way. This is very sophisticated stuff. It's more sophisticated than the Russians even have. And we don't know how well that would work, but in principle, it looks like the Iranians could even spot and detect stealth bombers 600 or 700 kilometers away. So that if this radar would work, it would obviously be a complete game changer. Hence the hesitation. A lot of saber rattling and everything, but in fact, no action yet.
Trump has vocalized or verbalized that he thinks a regime change would be the best thing to happen to Iran. We recall, Professor, that last year he said he doesn't want a regime change. Now he's going 180 on that. He's saying this as the USS Gerald Ford, the largest aircraft carrier in the world, and its battle group is headed toward the Strait of Gibraltar. Again, a third of the U.S. Navy is expected to be arriving in the region shortly. So this is textbook gunboat diplomacy, Professor. Basically, they've got Iran at a gunpoint. So can we just expect, is it reasonable to assume that whatever the U.S. and its allies, by extension Israel, wants, Iran is going to succumb to by the end of the week?
No. Well, just what I said. The Iranians have some red lines too, and they're not going to agree to all the conditions that the Israelis want them to agree to, and they're not going to obviously agree to a regime change. And we've been through hundreds of these over 100, not hundreds, but the U.S. has been involved in over 100 regime change operations, attempts to regime change since World War II, and most of them have ended in complete disaster. And if history is a guide, and they did unleash on Iran, it probably would be a complete disaster.
Before we continue with the video, let's talk about today's sponsor, Delete Me. Now, most people don't realize how much of their personal information is publicly available. Data brokers collect and sell details like your name, address, phone number, and even family connections. That's why I use Delete Me. It helps reduce that exposure. It takes just a few minutes to set up, and then they do all the work. They scan for where your information appears, verify those listings, and submit removal requests to hundreds of data broker sites. They also keep monitoring over time, since this information can resurface. I've been using it for over a year, and they have reviewed over 325 listings for my information. The reports show exactly what was found and what was removed, which makes the process transparent. Go to joindeleteme.com/David Lin, link down below, or scan the QR code here, and use my promo code DavidLin for 20% off of all consumer plans. Now, back to the video. True, but the U.S. has demonstrated in January that with the capture of Maduro in Venezuela, they could just enact regime changes at will. I mean, why is Iran any different? Yeah.
Iran is the farthest thing from Venezuela that I can imagine.
Okay.
I was President Caldera's chief advisor in 1995 and 1996 in Venezuela, so I know it pretty well. And it is not Iran, or as we used to say, Persia. Persia's been around for a while, and it's not going anyplace either.
I understand, but just help us, the layman, understand why special forces couldn't just go in and take out the president of Iran.
Number one, that was clearly an inside job, the Maduro thing.
Okay.
There was almost no gunfire or anything else, and obviously somebody ratted on Maduro. We don't know who. We don't know who for certain, but that part of it is one thing. Doing something like that in a well-armed, well-disciplined military operation in Iran would be another story. Look at what happened in June. What did we do in June? Well, not too much, actually, and we sent considerable, not as much as the Armada, but we sent quite a bit of firepower in there. And the Israelis were involved too. You have to keep in mind what we know what the Armada is, but you have to keep in mind what the counterattack is going to be, and how effective is the Armada going to be with this new Chinese radar? It might not be quite as effective as the bright boys at the Pentagon think it might be. And in fact, I think the bright boys are actually advising Trump to keep his powder dry.
So bottom line, you don't think this is going to have major impacts on the oil market this week, at least for the foreseeable future?
Well, not this week. I don't think this week, because I don't think much is going to happen in Geneva. And when you look at the Iranian economy, you have to remember, reading the Western press, you're reading essentially propaganda. Most of it is propaganda. Hanke's 95% rule. 95% of what you read in the press is either wrong or irrelevant. And it's true in spades with Iran. I mean, I'm the only one who measures the inflation rate in Iran, by the way.
What is it?
Today I measure it at 79.1%. Very accurate measures. Where do you find that in the press? You don't, because you find it on my X account, but the press doesn't even bother to look at it. They take whatever the CIA tells them and they put it in the paper. Also, if you look at the Iranian rial, it's the second worst currency in the world. It has depreciated, according to me. It's on Hanke's currency watch list. It's the second worst currency in the world. Venezuela's is number one. Number two is Iran. It's depreciated 43% year over year, which is a big depreciation. But all the press acts like it just happened. That's why we had these protests in the streets a few weeks ago in Iran, was that the rial collapsed. Well, it didn't. The depreciation of the rial, most of it happened actually before the 12-day war in June. So the reporting on all this is, shall we say, take it with a grain of salt.
Okay, let's move on to another part of the world, which is Russia. I want to talk about Russia and the U.S. dollar. Bloomberg reported on the 12th of February that in an internal Kremlin memo drafted by Putin envoy Kirill Dmitriev proposed a return to the U.S. dollar settlement for energy trade as part of a 7-point economic partnership pitched to Trump. So here are the 7 points. Core to this offer is like I mentioned, the return to the U.S. dollar settlement system would move, which would mean a stunning reversal of Kremlin policy. You'll recall that even prior to the Trump administration taking power in the White House this year, Putin last year was vocal about de-dollarizing, leading the BRICS nations to de-dollarize, and now it looks like in this memo that was leaked, they want to do the complete opposite. Can you comment on this? What do you know about this?
Yeah, well, the Bloomberg report was the only one who ever reported on this was Bloomberg, and it created a big stir. My friends in Moscow even contacted me about it. It's never been verified, and I think a tempest in a teacup, basically. And again, Hanke's 95% rule. 95% of what you read in the press is either wrong or irrelevant. And I think that there's an extremely high probability that this is just wrong.
Right. Okay. So
I could get with my contacts, which are very reliable in Moscow, I could get no confirmation or verification of anything like this. They gave it a big laugh.
Well, if it's not real, we can disregard it. But I think the concern here, or at least the scenario here that we can discuss, is potentially a huge reversal of the of flows back into the U.S. If suddenly the Russians were allowed to be using the U.S. dollars again. I think by the order of $834 billion, Russia's reserve surge, or dollar return, or a trap. Russia's foreign exchange reserves have surged to a record $833 billion as of February 1st. This could flow back into the U.S. in theory, I guess, if they're allowed to start trading again using the U.S. dollar.
Well, now, don't use those big numbers. If what you indicated was that's a fairly narrow window. What you read, that point is just price Russian oil in dollars and trade in dollars for the oil. That's not the total stock of reserves. That's just the flow in oil, only in oil. And it would require the U.S. to remove all the sanctions and everything else. So it's pretty far-fetched. But the numbers aren't 840 billion or anything like that.
Yeah. Okay. Just a bit more news on this. So a couple of days after the Bloomberg report, the Moscow Stock Exchange has allowed, for the first time since June 2024, transactions on the dollar-ruble currency pair on the exchange, trading between 70.5 to 76.3 rubles. Importantly, it cannot be said that the dollar trading has been restored. In fact, the Moscow Exchange presented a settlement, non-deliverable instrument. In other words, the purchased contract does not provide physical currency, and it cannot be withdrawn to a bank account. All profit and loss calculations are still made in rubles. But it's still, I guess, some progress following the report. What do you make of this?
Not much.
All right. We can move on then. What generally is your view on the dollar at this point in time? Is it still based primarily on your forecast and the DXY? Is it still based primarily on the money supply M2, or do you see other forces at play?
Oh, no, there are all kinds of other forces that affect an exchange rate. So my view is that the most important rate is the dollar euro rate. That's probably the most important price in the world, actually, that FX rate. And I think the fair value, and I've thought this for a number of years, is between about 120 and 140, and it's on the high side. It's not even in the high end of my 120, 140 range. It's been trading below 120 for years, and now it's 118, something like that. So it's the dollar talk is a lot of talk, in the sense that that's the de-dollarization talk. The dollar is king, and it's going to remain king. It's hard to knock a king off the throne. I think it probably will weaken and slide into my fair value zone, but it hasn't done it yet. 10 days ago or something like that, it actually pierced the 120. It went to 120 and changed, and then it strengthened and came back down to below 120. So you have to keep in mind that if you go back, let's say 2,700 years, something like that, roughly, there have only been 7 international currencies.
Yeah.
And the U.S. is the international currency right now. Now, what does that historical pattern tell you? It says that once established as an international currency, it's pretty hard to knock the king off the throne. And I think what we're going to end up with going forward is the king will remain the dollar. The big regional currency will remain the euro, although the euro's share of things is sliding a little bit because the Chinese yuan is coming in and challenging. And the Chinese yuan, it isn't replacing the dollar, it's replacing the euro. So you have kind of the big three with the yuan being much lower because the yuan can't really be an international currency because the Chinese have capital controls and exchange controls. So you have never seen a currency spreading its wings internationally if exchange controls exist. And the Chinese have indicated that they have no particular taste for removing the exchange controls. So until they do, they can challenge to a certain degree, and they have, but it's a minor. In the international scene, the Chinese yuan is a minor player. It's a footnote in the thing. Even the Japanese yen, which is just a regional currency, is much more important than the yuan.
Just on that note, before we move on, in order for China to assert its superpower dominance, does a country need to free float the yuan?
Well, no. They need to remove the exchange controls. That's the key. That's the key to the thing.
Let's move on to the U.S. economy. Before we talk about inflation, I want to share with you this rather humorous post I found online. Somebody reconstructed the divorce rate in the U.S. by using a series of data points from the National Center for Family and Marriage Research Trend Report, CDC, and historical demography literature, and then overlaid that with the Fed funds rate going back to 1955, Professor. I just saw this the other day, and I found it was rather interesting how there's not really a strict correlation, but it does seem to kind of move together.
Well, as they say, David, correlation doesn't imply causation.
No, definitely not. There's probably some other variables here. You can see divorce rate kind of peaked around the 80s, around the same time that the Fed funds rate was double digits. So I guess is it truth that family formation is probably dependent on economic health here, and I guess by extension inflation and growth?
I think economic health has a lot to do with it, and there are many cultural things that come in, but the economic thing comes into the picture because it's the affordability thing. What if now I can't remember the precise number, David, but it's something like the average age of the first purchase of a home by somebody, it's like late 30s. It's about almost 40 years of age. Well, if you can only afford to buy a home when you're 40 years old, that's almost slipping out of the childbearing range or marriage range.
Yeah.
So, I think a lot of this is tangled up with affordability.
The inflation rate is has come down slightly, 2.4%, less than expected. Previously, I think the month previous was a bit higher. Consumer price index for January accelerated 2.4% from the same time a year ago, down 0.3% from the prior month. I guess, is affordability coming back, you think?
Well, the two things on the number. The number didn't really surprise me that much in the sense that Hanke's golden growth rate for the money supply measured by M2 is 6.3%. Let's just call it 6%, okay? And it's been growing less than that since April of 2022. It's been growing less than Hanke's golden growth rate, a rate of growth consistent with hitting an inflation target of 2%. So the fact that the pressure on prices are always, the inflation rate is always a monetary phenomenon determined by monetary policy and the growth in the money supply. So I'm not too surprised with the fact that it's been kind of flatline for quite a few months actually, and that it came down one tick. It didn't really surprise me all that much. What I think, looking ahead, and this I think is important, is that I don't think the Fed is going to be able to put that genie back in the bottle. Meaning, what's that? 2% or less. I don't think it's going to 2% or less. And the reason for that is that the money supply is accelerated and almost is up at 6% now. That's one thing. And I think the Fed will continue to loosen the money supply. And that means what? It means that the genie won't get put back in the bottle. They won't reach the target of 2% or below.
Okay.
So we have my take on why the current measure went down a little bit, and my take on why I don't think it's going to go down to the target, and it'll probably start drifting up.
That is assuming they'll continue with the pace of M2 growth that we've seen so far, but perhaps the latest reading may incentivize them to slow the pace of money expansion. What do you think?
No, why it would be just the opposite. They see the inflation rate coming down and they say, "Oh, we can goose the thing a little bit." It's if it had gone up, David, then they would have said, "Oh, we got to tighten. This thing's out of control. It's going in the wrong direction." What if it would have gone from 2.7% to 3% instead of going from 2.7 to 2.4? Then they would have said, "Oh, we got to hold off and we not reduce the Fed funds rate, not do some of these other things that would loosen the money supply."
I understand what you mean, but at the same time, though, they may look at the labor market and say, "There's the labor market perhaps is doing well. There's no reason to continue easing monetary policy, especially with inflation coming down." So January jobs report showed 130,000 new payrolls added, beating expectations. However, at the same time, Fed Governor Waller dissented at the last FOMC meeting, citing essentially zero private sector job growth, quote unquote, in 2025. So we have a bit of a mismatch here in sentiment versus actual numbers. So what actually is the condition of the labor market, and how should the Fed respond?
Well, I think number one, what Waller said is correct. A lot of things coming out of Washington are just fictitious. I mean, they're not correct. Fake news, if you want. But what he said is correct, because the addition to the labor market, the number of new jobs created, the initial estimate for 2025 was 584,000 jobs, which is a big reduction from 2024. 2024 was 2.2 million. So that was the initial estimate, 584,000. Now they've revised that down to 181,000. So Waller is right. For Trump's tariffs have been a disaster for the labor market. The labor market, I've told you about this before, David. I said, if you look under the hood, remember when I told you, look under the hood, and the numbers are a little bit flaky. They don't look that great. But if you just look at the top side number that Waller was looking at, there's essentially been no new jobs added in the U.S. economy in 2025. So the big, beautiful bill and all these tariffs and everything, they were supposed to add jobs to the U.S. economy and add jobs to manufacturing. It's not happened. The thing's collapsed. Now, what does that tell you? That tells you that I think there's going to be tremendous pressure to loosen. The monthly numbers, by the way, David, those are very noisy anyway. Mm-hmm. It is moving all over the place. So yeah. I wouldn't put too much stock in a monthly number, quite frankly.
So bottom line, you expect the money supply to continue expanding because the labor market is weaker than may be reported, and inflation has somewhat come down a little bit. Is that correct?
Yes. Okay. Yes, that's correct.
And so what is your end of year?
And by the way, the key thing the Fed watches is the labor market. The key, you have to keep your eye on the labor market. The Fed always, when there's a potential change in monetary policy and the stance of monetary policy, that is usually driven by the Fed's take on what's happening in the labor market. That's the dominant thing. Inflation is also important. There's no question about that. But the real thing that bites is the labor market.
Just on that, Professor, what is your view on the Fed having a dual mandate and the second one being the labor market? A lot of central banks around the world don't have that. They just monitor inflation. Some would say it's excessive to have two mandates that are often contradictory to one another. Why not just have one, focus on inflation, and leave the labor market to Congress alone?
Oh, that would be fine with me. I was against adding the unemployment, and always have been. It should be inflation. They should do what the Swiss do. Have an inflation target. They should change that to a range like the Swiss. It should be from 0 to 2%. 0 to 2%. Now it's one number, 2%. It should be a range. And that's a much more realistic thing. And what should the range be? In my view, it should be the Swiss range, 0 to 2.
So bottom line is, what is your view on inflation for the remainder in 2026? I'll remind the audience that Professor Hanke basically nailed the inflation rate in 2024 and 2025 when you expected the inflation rate to come down. And then it was just, I believe, in the fall of last year, 2025, when you announced it on my show here, that you've changed your mind on inflation bottoming, and now it's picking up again. So what's your call for 2026?
No specific number itself, but I would be, number one, I said I don't think it's going down to 2% or below 2%.
Sure.
And I would be surprised if it went much below where it is right now for any sustained period. I think it's going up. I think it's going up. It's going to drift up. And the reason for that is that the money supply, although it's growing at less than Hanke's golden growth rate, it's accelerating. If you look at the 3-month and 6-month annualized rates of growth in the money supply, they're over my 6% already. So everything in economics it's at the margin. What's happening at the margin? And we have an acceleration going on for at least 6 months in the money supply.
Hold on. So the annual rate of M2 money growth is 4.6%. On a 6-month change basis is above 6%. Okay, so what does the quantity theory of money tell us the inflation rate should be if the M2 rate is growing at 6%, your golden growth rate? What does that imply for inflation?
It eventually, when it normalizes, let's say it's growing at 6% for a year or so, we should expect the inflation to tend towards 2%.
Okay, I see.
Again, these things aren't mechanical. You just get an exact, to 2 decimal points or anything like that. But let's look at the Greenspan years. When Greenspan was chairman of the Fed, what was the growth rate in the money supply? The average, I think it was 5.7 or 5.8%. It was a little below Hanke's golden growth rate. And what was the inflation rate? It was a little below 2%. That's how people should think about it. People get out in the weeds and they really don't understand what they're doing. Just go back to the Greenspan years, plug in what the rate of growth was during the Greenspan years for M2, and it's going to be a little bit below 6%. And that would imply that we should expect, if it's below 6%, that the inflation comes in a little bit below the target of 2%. And that's exactly what happened.
Let's follow up on inflation in the labor market in the next session. See what happens when the Fed meets in March. By the way, what do you expect the Fed to do in March?
I honestly, I haven't looked at the. Can we look at the Chicago Mercantile Exchange, the Fed
watch tool?
Yeah, that's the number. Whatever that
92%, no change.
Okay, so that's where I am. I'm with the market. I'm with the market.
All right. What would change your view? Let's say we're change this probability. What needs to happen from now until mid-March, which is 1 month exactly from now?
If there are more indications that we've got weakness in the labor market.
I see. Which I guess would have to be something dramatic in the next 4 weeks, because 1 month is not that much time for major changes in the labor market to take place.
That's true.
All right, let's move on to the final topic. I want to talk about this. In your book, Making Money Work, you've discussed re-empowering commercial banks, and I'll let you discuss that in more detail with the audience if you choose, Professor. But here is a piece of news that came out just yesterday from the Federal Reserve. They're set to loosen U.S. bank rules in an attempt to increase bank incentives to engage in mortgage origination and servicing from commercial banks. As you may be aware, banks have lost a major portion of their share of the U.S. mortgage market. Origination from banks has fallen from 60% in 2008 to 35% in 2023. This is according to Fed Vice Chair for Supervision, Michelle Bowman. And she wants to potentially reverse the trend of migration of mortgage activity to non-banks over the past 15 years. What are your thoughts about this? Do you have a view on whether or not they're doing the right thing here?
I do. This is the second shoe to drop with Governor Bowman, and the first one will come into play in April when the supplemental liquidity ratio comes off. Now that will loosen up monetary policy, because remember, the banks produce 80% of the money is produced by banks. It's not produced by the Fed. So that's first shoe. Now this is the second one, and it's going to do exactly the same thing. It's going to effectively loosen monetary policy, and this is the whole point in making money work, and that is bank regulations. David, here you go. Yep. That's the book. And our stress in there is that bank regulations are part of monetary policy. Most people think monetary policy is the Fed funds rate. It's baloney. The big thing is bank regulations. And the reason that's the big thing is that banks are the elephant in the room, commercial banks. And by changing these regulations, now she's done two here, the banks will have more capacity to make loans. And when they make a loan, that credit goes into somebody's checking account, and that checking account is part of the money supply. It adds to the money supply. So this all means exactly what I said earlier in our discussion, and that is, I think they're in a loosening phase, loosening up, and when they loosen up, of course, the money supply accelerates, and when it accelerates, inflation is not right around the corner, but around the corner with a lag, after they accelerate.
And just on, okay, that part makes sense, but just on the change in regulation in itself, are you concerned that eventually the banking industry will repeat the mistakes of 2008 unless certain guardrails are put in place to prevent them from?
Not really, because the commercial banks weren't the problem in the mortgage crisis. It wasn't the commercial banks. It was other financial institutions, but it wasn't commercial banks.
But many commercial banks originated mortgages and loans to people that shouldn't have received.
Well, the ones that got in trouble, like Lehman, that's not a bank.
I understand. Okay. So, all right.
And by the way, even Lehman, the biggest mistake was that the U.S. government under the Bush administration let Lehman go under, because, in my view, and this is all documented, they were solvent. And the rule is, the monetary rule is, if somebody's solvent and illiquid, the government loans money at a penalty interest rate to them and solves the liquidity problem. And if they're solvent, they're going to keep their head above water and be able to pay whatever the penalty loan rate is, pay the government back.
Mm-hmm.
But the key book on this is one of my colleagues, Lawrence Ball, wrote the definitive book on it, and it's very clear, reading Ball, that they made a huge mistake, because Lehman, in fact, was solvent. And so that's my take on that story.
Okay, great. I think we've covered enough ground. As always, please do write to myself and/or Professor Hanke. If you have any topics you'd like us to cover next time, we'll put Professor Hanke's email and my email below in the comments and in the description. And please do follow Professor Hanke as well. Where can we find you, Professor?
On X, at Steve_Hanke, and we're up, I think we have 830,000 followers today.
Very good. Okay, well, congrats on your growth. Keep those up. Please do help Professor Hanke grow his account. So follow him there, and we'll speak again soon. Take care for now.
Thank you, David. Have a great evening.
Yes, you as well. Thank you for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe.